Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Sterling's eyes said the first time he saw her restocking the crash carts at Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah. Katie Morrison moved through the fluorescent corridors like she was trying not to take up space, her scrubs hanging loose on a frame that suggested she'd learned long ago to be smaller than she actually was. The antiseptic smell hit her like it always did, not unpleasant, but loaded with memory. She breathed through it. Controlled inhalation. Hold. Release. The way you do when your body remembers things your mind is ordered never to speak about. Her hands trembled slightly as she arranged the defibrillator pads in their case, checked the crash cart's medication drawer one final time, verified the 4 pumps were charged. It wasn't fear. It was muscle memory trying to reconcile 2 versions of the same woman, the one in Navy-issue scrubs under fluorescent lights, and the one who'd held a collapsing aid station together in Tikrit while mortars rained down like God had decided the earth needed redecorating. The ambulance siren wailed outside, and Katie's shoulders tensed for exactly 2/3 of a second before she forced them back down. The siren faded into the distance. Not her responsibility. Not her patient. Not her war anymore. She wore long sleeves even in August heat, when Savannah's humidity could turn a walk to the mailbox into a cardiovascular event. The scars crisscrossing her forearms stayed hidden, thin white lines that told stories she wasn't allowed to tell, souvenirs from a classified operation in the Jolin district that the Navy had decided needed erasing from official record. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison had died on paper on a Thursday in March, killed in a tactical operation that technically never happened. The woman who'd pulled 17 people from a burning building under enemy fire had become a ghost. And ghosts were good at being invisible. The real Katie existed now only in the restricted files at Naval Special Warfare Group 2 and in the lockdown servers at JSOC headquarters in Arlington. The woman pushing a crash cart in Savannah General was nobody. A nurse. Competent. Quiet. The kind of employee that managers could point to when asked if they'd considered hiring nurses over 50. See, we did, she's right there, no bias here, move along. She'd chosen this carefully. A medium-sized hospital in a southern city where the pace was measured and the questions were few. Sacred Heart had 340 beds, a trauma line that stayed busy but not catastrophic, and most importantly, a location far enough from the Norfolk Naval Station that she could walk the hallways without passing too many people who might recognize the particular way she moved. That controlled precision. The way operators move when they've learned that fast sometimes means dead. Katie finished her cart check at 06 for 7 hours. 7 minutes before the shift officially began. She'd been doing this for 2 years, 3 months, and 14 days. Not that she was counting. Not that she'd written the numbers in a notebook hidden in the bottom of her locker, a private tally of days since her last contact with her son. Lieutenant. That's what he was now. Her son, James, who she'd been forbidden from contacting after the operation went sideways and the Pentagon decided that Katie Morrison's existence needed to become retroactively complicated. The official narrative said she'd suffered an acute psychiatric episode during deployment and had been medically discharged. The classified narrative, the one in the files only cleared above top secret compartmented, said that she'd been part of a direct action mission that had exposed a network of compromised personnel inside the command structure, and that for everyone's safety, particularly her son's safety, the connection between them needed to be severed at the operational level. So she'd stayed in Virginia just long enough to watch him graduate from officer candidate school at Quantico from a distance that made it impossible for him to see her face. Then she'd packed a truck and driven south. She'd become invisible. She'd become a nurse. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the specific staleness of a space where hospital staff cycled through at all hours, leaving traces of their exhaustion behind. Katie poured herself a cup from the pot that had been sitting on the burner since the night shift began at 2,100 hours, making it roughly 9 hours old and thick enough to seal wounds. She didn't taste it. She never tasted anything anymore. The sensory dampening had been an unexpected side effect of the severance protocol. The Navy psychologists had said it might fade. They'd lied about a lot of things. The door swung open at 0653 hours, and Katie heard the sound before she saw him. Italian loafers against tile. The specific click-click-click of expensive shoes worn by a man who walked like he was always entering a room that had been waiting specifically for him. Dr. Sterling, Chief of Cardiothoracic Surgery. 48 years old, according to the hospital directory, Katie had memorized the way she memorized every exit and every potential weapon in every room she occupied. Yale Medical School. Private practice in Charleston before he'd joined Sacred Heart 8 months ago. No defensive lawsuits, which meant he was either very good or very careful about which patients he allowed to die. He poured himself coffee with a kind of casual entitlement that came from a lifetime of people getting out of his way. Katie watched the coffee level drop in the pot and made a mental note to brew a fresh batch. Not for him. For the nurses who'd come after him. Dr. Sterling turned, cup in hand, and his gaze swept across the break room. It lingered on Katie for approximately 1.3 seconds, just long enough for her to read the assessment happening behind his eyes. New. Older. Quiet. Hands that didn't steady themselves in the kind of way that suggested medical school or ambition. The kind of nurse that hospitals hired to fill gaps and manage the overflow. Expendable. His smile suggested he was already planning which tasks he could hand her, which responsibilities he could avoid, and which complaints about her work would stick if he decided to make them. Katie held his gaze for exactly as long as a respectful subordinate would, then looked away first. Gave him the slight deference that made men like Dr. Sterling feel validated in their assumptions about who she was. "Morning, doctor," she said quietly, the words barely above the hum of the break room's refrigerator. Her voice was the voice of someone who'd learned that making noise got you noticed, and noticed was the last thing she needed to be. He nodded once, the kind of nod you give to staff whose names you haven't bothered learning. Then he left, his footsteps clicking down the hallway toward the cardiac ICU, leaving the smell of his cologne hanging in the air like a territorial marker. Katie finished her coffee, or rather, she held it while her mouth pretended to finish it. Then she stood, rinsed the cup, and prepared to begin her shift. The crash cart was positioned in the hallway. The medications were checked. The defibrillator pads were accounted for. Everything was as it should be, which meant nothing. Because Katie Morrison had learned in Tikrit that the moment everything felt secure was usually the moment everything decided to fall apart. She didn't know it yet, but Dr. Sterling was already beginning his assessment of her. Not as a potential employee to cultivate. Not as a colleague to respect. But as a problem. A body that was taking up space and salary in his hospital. A quiet woman with steadied hands and secrets written in the way she moved. A liability just waiting for him to figure out what she was hiding. What happened in the next 72 hours would change both their lives. But first, there would be humiliation. There would be a test. And there would be a moment when Katie Morrison would look a man in the eye and say something that would make him understand, for the first time, that he'd made a catastrophic miscalculation about who he was standing next to. But that wasn't today. Today, Katie moved through her shift like she was supposed to, invisible, competent, and entirely aware of the exact location of every exit in a 200-bed radius. She restocked supplies. She took vital signs. She smiled when it was appropriate and said nothing when silence was safer. In the cardiac ICU, at the nurse's station, she paused long enough to look at a photograph taped inside her locker door. A young man in dress blues, stern-faced and proud. Lieutenant James Morrison. Her son. Officially forbidden from knowing that his mother was alive and working 73 miles from his base at Camp Lejeune. Operationally severed from any knowledge that the woman who'd raised him had given the Navy everything, including him, in service to something bigger than a single parent's need to be known. She taped the photograph back down and closed the locker. Then Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Morrison, who the world thought was dead and whose name the Navy had scrubbed from every official record, went back to being just a nurse. The break room at Sacred Heart smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. Dr. Sterling stood at the center of the gathered residents, his $12,000 Omega Seamaster catching the fluorescent light as he checked the time, 7:41 a.m., morning rounds in 13 minutes. He smiled the way a shark smiles before feeding. "I'm giving our new girl 1 week," he announced, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man who had never been wrong about people. Any takers on that bet? The residents exchanged glances. 3 of them chuckled nervously. A fourth, a second-year named Patterson, laughed outright and said, "She'll crack by Wednesday." Sterling's smile widened. He'd chosen his audience perfectly. These were ambitious people, people who understood that loyalty was rewarded and doubt was dangerous. The bet was less about money and more about alignment. You either agreed that Katie Morrison didn't belong at Sacred Heart, or you were naive. There was no third option in Dr. Sterling's world. Katie stood at the coffee station, her back to the group, pouring hot water into a foam cup. She heard every word. The ceramic carafe trembled slightly in her hands, not from fear, but from the particular kind of restraint that came from having survived worse chaos than a cafeteria full of ambitious doctors. She took one measured breath. Then another. The trembling stopped. Her hand steadied. She turned, cup in hand, and met Sterling's eyes across the break room. No flinch. No blush. Just a flat, unflinching stare that held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds before she turned back to her coffee. Sterling's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Something in that moment confused him. The new nurse had absorbed the entire weight of his judgment, his mockery, his public declaration of her incompetence, and her response was absolute silence. Worse, her response was indifference. She had simply looked at him as if he were a problem she'd already solved. He filed the moment away. He would figure out how to break her? Everyone broke eventually. The morning passed in the rhythm of Sacred Heart's chaos. Patients arrived. Katie moved through the unit like water, efficient, quiet, present. She checked vitals on a post-op cardiac patient in room for 12, adjusted for drips in room for 08, held the hand of an elderly man in room for 05 who asked if she thought his daughter would visit today. "She will," Katie said, and somehow he believed her. There was something in her voice that didn't permit doubt. At 11:13 a.m., Sterling made his rounds through the ICU with 3 interns trailing behind him like pilot fish. He stopped at the nurse's station where Katie was reviewing cardiac monitor strips, her handwriting on the charts precise and clinical, 16 years of documentation practice, most of it in field hospitals where sloppy charting got people killed. Sterling watched her work for a moment, then tossed his clipboard onto the desk in front of her. It skidded across the laminate and fell to the floor with a plastic clatter that echoed through the unit. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the 3 interns to hear, loud enough for the 4 nurses at the adjacent station to turn and watch. "If you can't document properly, maybe you should find easier work. Nursing requires a certain attention to detail. Clearly not your strong suit." One of the interns, a dark-haired woman named Chen, winced. She'd seen this before. Sterling had a talent for calibrated humiliation. Just harsh enough to be professionally devastating, just ambiguous enough to seem like it was about performance rather than cruelty. Katie knelt slowly. Her movements were controlled, economical, the same economy of motion that came from combat training where wasted energy could cost lives. She retrieved the clipboard from the floor. The pages were pristine. The documentation was flawless. Every vital sign recorded at the correct interval, every medication dose charted with pharmacy approval codes, every patient assessment written with medical precision that would make a resident jealous. She stood and held the clipboard out to Sterling. Their eyes met. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She watched her own hand lift and wipe it away, steady as surgical steel, without breaking eye contact with him for a single moment. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he and the 3 interns could hear. "You mistake silence for weakness, doctor. That's a dangerous habit." Sterling's jaw tightened. The muscles around his mouth went rigid. For the first time, the casual cruelty in his expression was replaced by something else, confusion, maybe, or the first small seed of something he couldn't quite name. A warning. He turned away without responding and continued his rounds, but his timing was off now, his rhythm disrupted. One of the interns, Chen, watched Katie return to her station and thought, "Asterisk, this woman is not what he thinks she is." Asterisk. The cafeteria at Sacred Heart was crowded at lunch. 50 conversations hummed across the space, the sound mixing with the clink of plastic trays and the hiss of the soda fountain. Katie sat alone at a corner table, eating a turkey sandwich with mechanical precision. She wasn't tasting it. Her mind was compartmentalized. The part that was Katie the nurse filed away the morning's confrontation, but the part that was Senior Chief Petty Officer Morrison was doing something different. She was calculating, assessing, running scenarios. She'd encountered hostile authority figures before. The key was patience. And documentation. And the quiet, unstoppable momentum of being right when everyone else was wrong. Dr. Sterling walked past her table at 12:14 p.m. He was returning from the cafeteria line, his tray loaded with a chicken Caesar salad and expensive water imported from somewhere in Switzerland. As he passed Katie's table, his hip brushed her tray. Just enough impact to seem accidental. Just enough force to send the scrambled eggs, the toast, the orange juice, all of it, cascading to the floor in a spectacular, public collapse. The crash silenced the cafeteria. 50 conversations stopped mid-sentence. 50 heads turned toward the sound. "So clumsy, sweetheart," Sterling said loudly, his voice carrying concern that sounded almost genuine. He smiled at her. "Maybe you need steadier hands." Katie knelt in the spreading puddle of orange juice and broken ceramic. The smell of citrus and bleach filled her immediate space. Her breathing remained controlled. This was information, not trauma. This was data to be filed and analyzed. She began picking up the pieces of plate, one shard at a time, her hand steady, her expression utterly calm. No anger. No humiliation. No response at all. A nurse whispered to another across an empty table, "Why doesn't she just quit?" The second nurse shrugged and said, "Because she's smarter than that." Katie didn't hear either comment. She was focused on the task, hands moving with the precision of someone who had performed emergency medical procedures under mortar fire in streets where a single mistake meant someone's child didn't come home. Scrambled eggs were not the worst mess she'd cleaned. Not even close. She stood, tray in hand, and disposed of the debris in the trash bin without once looking at Sterling. When she returned to her seat, her lunch was gone. She got up and left the cafeteria. Behind her, Sterling sat at the cardiology table with the chief of cardiology, a man named Rothschild who had connections to the hospital board. Sterling cut into his salad with deliberate precision. "She'll be gone by Friday," Sterling said quietly, just loud enough for Rothschild to hear. "I'll make sure of it." Rothschild smiled and nodded. He owed Sterling favors. Sterling had steered 3 high-value insurance referrals to Rothschild's private practice. Loyalty flowed downward, but indebtedness flowed upward, and Sterling had been very careful to accumulate the right kind of debts in the right places. "Whatever you need," Rothschild said. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1:33 p.m., Katie was restocking the crash cart in the ICU when the emergency intercom crackled to life with the kind of static that made everyone's spine straighten. Incoming trauma. ETA 3 minutes. Marine casualty, ticket-related injuries, cardiac compromise suspected. Prep trauma Bay 1. The words hung in the air like a suspended breath. Trauma Bay 1 meant something bad. Something that required immediate preparation. Katie's hand stilled on the defibrillator paddle she'd been checking. Her breathing changed, just barely perceptibly, just enough that if you were watching very carefully, you might notice. Which she wasn't, but her body knew. Tikrit. The medical tent. The extraction at 0300 hours. The screaming. The sand in her teeth. The boy in her arms who was still alive because she'd stopped the bleeding. She'd never seen his face after that night. She'd only heard his voice over a radio for months later, a different voice, older, giving orders to a new unit in Sanjin Valley. She set down the paddles and continued moving. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with her squadron designation embroidered by hand during a quiet night in Kandahar, suddenly felt visible, as if it were broadcasting her secrets across the ICU. She pushed the feeling down. Compartmentalization was a survival skill. She was good at it. The paramedics rushed through Sacred Heart's emergency bay at 1:52 p.m., and the Marine on the stretcher had a face she recognized. The paramedics rushed through Sacred Heart's emergency bay at 1:52 p.m., and the Marine on the stretcher had a face she recognized. Captain James Morrison. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The man her son had mentioned exactly once before the orders came down, the Pentagon directive that redacted his name from her life, that classified their entire relationship into a black box labeled Need to Know Only. Katie stood at the nurse's station watching the intake board update in real time, medivaced from Tikrit. Multiple trauma. Airway compromised. Her hands went still on the keyboard. The stretcher screamed past her position. 2 paramedics were calling vitals in that controlled chaos rhythm that meant they'd been running hard. BP 118/71, dropping. Heart rate 142. Oxygen saturation 89% on high flow. The captain's uniform was shredded. Blood darkened the front of his body armor where rounds had punched through ceramic plates that had done their job right up until they hadn't. A 3rd-degree medic was maintaining manual ventilation, squeezing a bag valve mask with the focus of someone whose actions meant the difference between a Marine going home and a flag folded into a triangle. Katie moved without deciding to move. Muscle memory took over, the same reflexes that had activated in Tikrit under mortar fire, when dust and screaming had become her grammar, when hands became more important than rank. She intercepted the stretcher at the trauma bay threshold. "What's his name?" she asked the lead paramedic, though she already knew. "Captain Morrison, 3rd Bat, 5th Marines. IED detonated approximately 47 minutes ago. Estimated blood loss 2.2 liters. We've got 2 large ball lines running, 1 unit whole blood already hung." The paramedic didn't pause, didn't look away from the captain's face. "Just facts. Just data. Conscious on arrival at the FOB. Started decompensating during transport. We're seeing muffled heart tones." Muffled. That word landed like a round downrange. Katie was already moving toward the trauma bay, already calling for the team before her voice caught up with her brain. The hospital code came over the intercom clean and automatic. "Trauma activation, Bay 2. All available surgical staff to Bay 2. This is not a drill." They wheeled him past the threshold and the world compressed into the 6x12-foot space where Sacred Heart kept its most expensive equipment and its sharpest people. Dr. Sterling wasn't one of them. He was in a board meeting on the 4th floor, probably discussing quarterly metrics or hospital rebranding initiatives, probably accepting compliments about the Marine casualty that would arrive in a few hours and how fortunate the hospital would be to have his expertise. That's what he didn't know. That was the advantage Katie held, the gap between his assumptions and the actual parameters of the situation. The trauma team assembled like they'd practiced it 10,000 times, because they had. Respiratory therapist. 2 surgical nurses. Anesthesia resident. The emergency medicine doctor, Chen, who was young and sharp and had that particular quality of competence that came from spending 62 weeks a year in this room watching people's bodies decide whether to cooperate with survival. They cut away the captain's uniform in synchronized movements. Katie stepped into position at his left side, scanning for the injury pattern while her fingers found his carotid pulse. Strong. Rapid. The vessel thick under her fingertips, resilient, the body of a man who'd trained hard and survived worse than this, until today. The ultrasound machine wheeled into position. One of the surgical nurses, Rodriguez, new to the unit, 19 months of Sacred Heart experience, was already running the transducer across Morrison's chest. Her face changed. That micro-expression of a clinician seeing something wrong, something requiring immediate attention. "Doctor, we're seeing fluid. Significant fluid around the heart." Dr. Chen didn't hesitate. "Cardiac tamponade." "Consistent with," Rodriguez said. She was steady. "Good tech work." Beck's triad. Muffled sounds, distended neck veins, hypertension starting now. As if to punctuate the sentence, the monitor registered a blood pressure drop. 115/68. Then 108/64. The trend was the message. The body was losing its ability to maintain pressure because fluid was compressing the heart, restricting its ability to fill, strangling the organ from the outside in. Katie's vision narrowed. Everything peripheral fell away except the patient and the problem. Cardiac tamponade was a clock. Not an abstract concern. A literal countdown. If they didn't drain that pericardium in the next 3 minutes, Captain Morrison's heart would have nowhere to expand, would collapse into itself, and his brain would stop receiving oxygen. Brain death would follow. The only treatment was immediate pericardiocentesis, threading a needle through the chest wall into the pericardial sac and draining the blood that was killing him. Page Dr. Sterling. Tell him it's trauma urgent. Dr. Chen was already prepping, already moving with the practiced precision of someone who'd done this procedure maybe 7 times, with supervision, never under actual crisis conditions where hesitation meant a patient's death. Katie pulled a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart. Subxiphoid angle. That was the approach for this situation. Under the ribcage, angling toward the patient's left shoulder. Gentle. Precise. A 1/4 inch of deviation would mean the needle sliding into the liver or stomach instead of the pericardial space. Pain was information. Pain was data. But death was permanent. The intercom crackled. Dr. Sterling to Trauma Bay 2. Dr. Sterling to Trauma Bay 2. Katie had the needle positioned. Betadine swab. Sterile field. The room had shifted into that particular quality of silence that happened when everyone understood the stakes simultaneously. Not quiet. Silence. The kind where you could hear the ventilator's mechanical breath and the 4 pumps' urgent beeping and the monitor's accelerating rhythm as Morrison's oxygen saturation began to slide. 94%. 91%. The body was running out of time. Dr. Sterling arrived for minutes and 12 seconds later, moving with the confidence of someone who'd never encountered a situation he couldn't handle through seniority. He glanced at the monitor, assessed the team, and took in the situation with the eye of a man who'd been trained in emergency medicine before his priorities had shifted toward yacht payments and country club memberships. What do we have? Cardiac tamponade, Dr. Chen said. Fluids compressing the heart. Pressures dropping, O2 sat falling. We're preparing for immediate pericardiocentesis. Sterling stepped forward with the kind of authority that filled rooms. Katie stepped back because that's what hospital hierarchy demanded, and because Sterling had made the personnel decisions that kept her invisible, kept her alive as a shadow. The room's energy shifted toward him. That's what his presence did, it magnetized attention, pulled focus like gravity. He took the needle from Chen's hand. Looked at it like he was assessing a chess piece. The captain's oxygen saturation was at 87% now. The blood pressure had become a whisper. 82/52. The clock was becoming seconds instead of minutes. Sterling's hands moved toward the patient's chest. Katie watched the tremor. Small. Practiced. The kind of micro-movement that meant doubt had found a home in his muscle memory. He'd done this procedure maybe twice, both times with senior attending supervision, both times with casualties who weren't actively dying, both times with the kind of controlled conditions that didn't exist in this room right now. The needle approached the subxiphoid space. His breathing had shifted. Shallow. Controlled. The monitor registered 84% oxygen saturation. Katie felt the calculation happening in real time, the physics of decompression, the mathematics of cellular oxygen debt, the precise point where a body's systems began to cascade toward failure. 3 minutes. Maybe less. The needle was still 3 millimeters from the pericardial sac. Sterling's hand froze. Not obviously. Not dramatically. Just a pause. A hesitation. The needle held steady but not advancing. The captain was alive on this side of the decision and dead on the other, and Sterling was standing at the threshold unable to commit to the next movement. Katie moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't speak. Her left hand secured the sterile field and her right hand covered Sterling's, guided the needle with the kind of certainty that came from muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Ticrit had taught her this. A building collapsing. 11 Marines trapped in the rubble. Her hands had done this in darkness, had done this with incoming rounds painting the wall behind her, had done this because hesitation was a luxury that dead men had already paid for. The needle advanced. She felt the give. The specific resistance pattern as it pierced the pericardial membrane. The syringe filled with blood immediately, dark, oxygenated, the fluid that had been strangling a Marine's heart. 10 cubic centimeters, 20 cubic centimeters, 30 cubic centimeters. The monitor began to respond. The pressure started climbing. 85/58. 92/61. The oxygen saturation reversed course. 86%. 88%. 91%. The room released a breath it didn't know it was holding. Captain Morrison's eyes opened. Not fully awake. But present. Still here. Dr. Sterling stared at Katie with an expression that moved through shock, then calculation, then rage, the particular rage of a man watching his worldview collapse in real time. He'd just watched her do what he couldn't. Had just witnessed competence that asked questions. That noticed patterns. That might, given time and attention, see through the billing codes he'd been running through this ICU for 8 months. $840,000 in inflated charges across 47 patients. Insurance fraud that kept his mortgage current on a Savannah waterfront property worth $2.8 million. Katie stepped back. Withdrew her hands. Let the gravity of what had just happened settle into the room like dust after an explosion. Dr. Sterling's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from the patient to the monitor to Katie and back again, and in that calculation, she saw the moment when his priorities reorganized. The Marine would survive. The crisis was resolved. But Katie Morrison had just become something worse than invisible. She'd become a threat. The monitors started screaming at 1,730 hours. Captain Morrison's blood pressure plummeted like a stone dropped down a well, systolic dropping from 118 to 94 to 67 in the span of 4 breaths. The ICU bay erupted into controlled chaos, residents and nurses converging with the jerky movements of people suddenly realizing something had switched from stable to terminal. Dr. Sterling was 3 bays down, reviewing charts. He didn't hear it at first. Nobody heard anything but the alarms. Katie heard it differently. She was at the medication dispensary when the cardiac monitor's rhythm changed, not flatline, but something worse. A sound like a deflating tire, the electrical activity of a heart drowning in its own fluid. Her hand stopped moving. Her head tilted. Every cell in her body that had spent 8 years reading the sounds of dying men in the dark suddenly went perfectly, absolutely still. Beck's triad. She knew it before she saw it. Muffled heart sounds. Distended jugular veins. Blood pressure collapse. Cardiac tamponade, blood pooling inside the pericardium, the membrane surrounding his heart, compressing it with every beat until the organ couldn't pump anymore. A silence in her chest, the kind that comes from recognizing a death sentence, and then her legs were moving. The young resident at Morrison's bedside, Dr. Patel, stood frozen, hands raised uselessly, staring at the monitor as if the numbers might suddenly reverse through sheer force of will. 2 nurses gripped the bed rails. A respiratory therapist reached for the ventilator settings and then didn't, caught between protocols that didn't exist yet. The silence was the worst part. That paralysis where the human brain refuses to accept what the machines are screaming. Katie Morrison entered that silence like a knife through water. Needle. 14 gauge. Her voice came out flat, commanding, the voice of someone who had given orders in languages these people didn't speak. Pericardiocentesis kit. Now. Dr. Patel blinked. We should call. He's coding. You want to watch, or you want to move? The question wasn't really a question. Katie was already gloved, already leaning over the captain's exposed chest, her scarred hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst. The hands were everything, steady as a surgical laser, unmarred by the tremor that shock should have placed there. The kind of hands that had held lives together in rooms where holding anything together seemed impossible. The kit arrived in the hands of a trauma nurse who'd been working Sacred Heart for 6 years. Katie didn't thank her. Didn't acknowledge her. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, below the xiphoid process, angled toward the left shoulder at 45 degrees. One motion. 30 years of muscle memory compressed into a single motion that could have killed him if the angle was wrong by half an inch. The hiss of air escaping. Negative pressure releasing. Dark blood, old blood, clotted blood, the kind that had been pooling inside his pericardium for the last 12 minutes, filling the syringe. O2 sat was climbing. 74. 78. 82. How long? Katie's eyes never left the cardiac monitor. 7 minutes from initial drop, someone said. She kept draining. The pressure came off his heart like a fist unclenching. The rhythm steadied. The blood pressure climbed, 90. 105. 120. The monitors transitioned from the shriek of alarm to the steady, almost musical beeping of normalcy. Captain Morrison's eyes flickered. His chest rose on its own. The ventilator became support, not salvation. 90 seconds. That's all it took to move a man from the edge of death back to the side of the living. Dr. Sterling appeared in the ICU bay entrance at exactly the moment the captain's vital signs stabilized. His face moved through a sequence of expressions like a man watching a building he thought was empty turn out to be occupied. Surprise. Then calculation. Then something harder to name, the look of a man watching an asset become a liability in real time. Katie stepped back from the bedside, the syringe of dark blood still in her gloved hand. She didn't acknowledge Sterling's presence. Didn't make eye contact. Just turned to Dr. Patel and said, "Echocardiogram in the next hour. If there's reaccumulation, we drain again." 10 words. Precise. Professional. The kind of order that comes from someone who has already determined the outcome and is now simply explaining the obvious. Sterling stepped into the bay. His hand moved to the captain's chart, the same chart where Katie's notes were already being written by the trauma nurse, detailed notes about the procedure Katie had just performed. He looked at those notes. He looked at Katie. He looked at the captain, whose color was returning, whose breathing was regular, whose pulse was no longer the irregular flutter of a drowning organ. The next words out of Sterling's mouth changed everything. "The captain is stable thanks to quick intervention," he announced to the assembled staff, his voice smooth and authoritative and absolutely certain of its own command. "We got lucky today. Excellent team response. Let's get him post-procedure imaging and keep him on the monitor for the next 4 hours." His hand was already writing on the chart, documentation flowing from his pen like he'd been the one holding the needle. Like he'd been the one reading the body's signals in real time. 2 residents nodded, the kind of nod that comes from people who see a senior physician taking credit and assume that's how the system works. One of them whispered something to the other. They both looked at Katie with the kind of distance that comes from suddenly not being sure whose chain of command she actually occupied. Sterling's eyes met hers for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to communicate something that had nothing to do with medicine. Long enough for her to watch him make a decision. Then he turned and walked out of the ICU bay, and Katie heard him making a phone call before he'd even reached the end of the corridor. The first call was to the hospital board chair, a man named Whitmore who owed Sterling for a malpractice cover-up 2 years ago, a botched surgery that Sterling had documented as patient noncompliance rather than his own miscalculation. Sterling's voice was smooth, conversational, the kind of voice that made unreasonable requests sound like reasonable solutions. "Jim, I need a staff review initiated immediately. Credential irregularities. Patient safety concerns. One of the nurses on my service. Yes, I know it's late. That's why I need it fast." He hung up without goodbyes. The second call went to references Katie had listed on her application from a facility in Jacksonville. Sterling had the number from the file in his office, the personnel folder he'd pulled earlier in the week when he first decided she needed to disappear. He planted the seeds with the precision of someone who understood how institutional power worked. "This is Dr. Sterling, Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah. I'm conducting a reference check on a former employee, Katie Morrison. I have some concerns about narcotic discrepancies during her tenure with your facility. Did you have similar issues?" He listened. He said, "That's troubling. Thank you for your candor." He hung up knowing those people would now confirm rumors that had never actually existed. The third call was to a private investigator named Roland who owed Sterling a favor from a divorce proceeding Sterling had financed. "I need a termination file by end of business. Katie Morrison, RN. Recent hire, Sacred Heart. I need it airtight. Credential issues, policy violations, whatever you can manufacture. I'll pay double if it's done in 90 minutes. Sterling gave him Katie's information and a retainer amount that made the request sound urgent and non-negotiable. 90 minutes later, Security Chief Hammond appeared at the ICU nurse's station with a folder in his hand and an expression that suggested he'd rather be somewhere else. "Ms. Morrison, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation into procedural violations and credential irregularities." He didn't meet her eyes. Couldn't meet her eyes, because the folder in his hand was obviously constructed in a single afternoon, because the allegations didn't match any hospital incident report, because on some fundamental level Hammond knew this was theater and Katie Morrison had done something that scared someone important. Katie took one measured breath. "What violations?" Her voice was steady. Not quiet, steady. There's a difference. Quiet suggests fear. Steady suggests that fear had never been invited to this conversation. Hammond actually flinched. "You'll receive formal notice. Please collect your personal items and surrender your badge. Now, please." She walked to her locker. She'd been working at Sacred Heart for 4 months and had accumulated exactly enough personal items to fit in a standard cardboard box, a cracked coffee mug with a faded anchor insignia from a submarine tour, a dying succulent she'd been nursing for 3 months because some things don't deserve to die alone, and a photograph of her son in dress blues taken at his commissioning ceremony, the last time she'd laid eyes on him before the Navy erased her from official existence. The Marine standing next to him in the photo was Captain James Morrison, her son's commanding officer, the man she'd just saved in an ICU bay 3 hours ago. She didn't look at either man in the photograph. Rain hammered the parking lot like applause as she stood at the bus stop on Whitaker Street, the cardboard box growing soggy in her arms. The jacket she wore had a unit patch sewn inside the lining, faded now, fabric worn almost transparent, the only physical proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Morrison had ever existed at all. A cab drove past and splashed gutter water onto her shoes. She didn't flinch. The water was cold. Pain was information. And right now, the information she had was that she'd moved from invisible to erased in the space of 90 minutes. What she didn't know was that the wheels were already turning in an office in Arlington, Virginia. A VA hospital administrator had received a classified call from a Navy liaison, a request that had come through 3 separate chain-of-command channels, each one stamped with enough security clearance that no one in Arlington questioned it. The administrator was already drafting an invitation that would arrive in exactly 3 hours. The language was formal, official, and impossible to refuse. But that wasn't the worst part, and that wasn't the interesting part either. The interesting part was what happened at 20:30 hours, when Captain Morrison's eyes opened with the clarity of a man who'd been pulled back from something and remembered exactly who pulled him. The phone call started at 18:47 hours. Sterling sat in his office with the door locked, blinds drawn, his hands moving with the mechanical precision of a man executing a predetermined protocol. The first call went to Richard Chen, the board chair, a man who'd owed Sterling favor since 2022, when Sterling had quietly amended a surgical report to protect Chen's brother-in-law from a malpractice discovery. The phone rang twice before Chen picked up. "Richard. We have a situation." Sterling's voice was steady, controlled, the voice of someone used to moving pieces across a board. Nurse Morrison in ICU. I need her terminated. Today. Within the hour if possible. Dr. Sterling, I'm in a meeting with. Today, Richard. No, please. No explanation. Just the weight of 2 years of accumulated obligation. She's been diverting narcotics. I have documentation. The lie came out like a rehearsed line from a script Sterling had written in the moment between Morrison's hand steadying and his own certainty crumbling. Chen would call the director. The director would move fast. That was how favors worked. The second call took 90 seconds. Sterling dialed Marcus Webb, a private investigator who specialized in termination files so airtight that even union lawyers wouldn't touch them. Webb had built the portfolio on Morrison already: 3 interviews with fabricated witnesses, falsified incident reports, a timeline constructed with the precision of someone who understood that documentation was reality in institutional settings. Marcus, I need you to finalize the Morrison file. Make it criminal. Narcotics diversion. I want it unsustainable from a legal standpoint. I don't want her to even attempt reinstatement. Webb didn't ask questions. Questions were bad for business. Questions meant complications. I'll have it complete by 1900 hours. The third call was to Administrative Director Patricia Okafor, who owed Sterling nothing but understood perfectly how to move a termination through hospital bureaucracy without creating a paper trail that invited scrutiny. 1 call. 1 conversation about an urgent personnel matter. 1 request that she initiate immediate separation protocols while the documentation was being compiled. The machinery would turn. It always did. By 1930 hours, the machinery was spinning. Security Chief Hammond appeared at Katie's station in the ICU while she was reviewing Captain Morrison's post-procedure vitals. His face carried the expression of someone performing a necessary but distasteful task. Nurse Morrison. You need to come with me to administration. Now. Katie didn't ask why. She'd lived long enough in systems of authority to recognize the tone of a summary dismissal. She followed Hammond down the corridor, past the nursing stations where colleagues suddenly found urgent tasks requiring their full attention. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby overhead. The elevator descended in silence. The meeting lasted 8 minutes. Patricia Okafor sat behind her desk with a termination letter already printed, already signed. The folder contained Marcus Webb's fabricated documentation, time-stamped incident reports that Katie had never been near, witness statements from nurses Katie had never worked with, medication counts that showed discrepancies on days she'd been off shift. The architecture of it was beautiful in its completeness. The lies were airtight. As of this moment, your employment is terminated for gross violation of hospital policy regarding controlled substances, Okafor said, and her voice carried the rehearsed tone of someone reading words she'd spoken to others before. Security will escort you to collect your personal effects. You are not to return to any hospital facility under the Sacred Heart system without explicit written permission from my office. Do you understand? Katie's jaw tightened. Just barely. Just enough for Hammond to notice. Just not enough to break composure. I understand. 20 minutes later, she stood at her locker pulling down the cracked mug from the top shelf, a gift from a veteran she'd nursed through bypass surgery 5 years ago, and the dying succulent that had somehow survived on the humid air of the ICU, and the photograph of her son in dress blues, Lieutenant Junior Grade James Morrison, commissioned as an officer, serving openly, the connection to her officially non-existent. Hammond handed her a cardboard box. The same kind of cardboard box that moving companies used. The same kind of box that carried the weight of erasure. I'm sorry, Hammond said, and meant it. Katie didn't respond. She placed the mug, the succulent, and the photograph into the box with the careful deliberation of someone packing away a life. The unit patch from her jacket, the faded ticket patch sewn into the lining in thread that had held for 18 years, stayed where it was. Sterling hadn't found it. Sterling didn't know it existed. Sterling thought he was eliminating a vulnerability when he was actually just confirming that Katie Morrison's most dangerous asset was the one thing he could never find. The rain hit her face the moment she stepped outside. Savannah rain, warm and heavy, the kind that hammered parking lots and turned asphalt into temporary rivers. It soaked through her jacket, the one with the patch still sewn inside the lining, and she didn't seek shelter. She stood at the bus stop holding the cardboard box against her chest, rain dripping from her hair, her scrubs clinging wet to her skin, and thought about what happened next. Inside Sacred Heart, in the recovery area adjacent to the main ICU, Captain James Morrison's eyes opened. Not slowly. Not gradually. But with the sudden clarity of a man returning from the edge of something, his consciousness snapping back like a string pulled taut and released. His breathing was steady. His color was returning. The cardiac tamponade was resolved. The blood that had compressed his heart was gone. And in that moment of full consciousness, he remembered. The hands that had performed the pericardiocentesis. The voice that had spoken over the assembled physicians. The woman who'd moved with the terrifying precision of someone who'd done this before, done this under mortar fire, done this in a place called Tikrit where the rules of medicine were written in blood and dust and impossible choices. Captain Morrison pressed the call button. When the attending physician arrived, not Sterling, Sterling was occupied with his 3 phone calls, Morrison's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. That nurse. The one who performed the procedure. I need her name. But Katie was already gone. Already standing in the rain with a cardboard box containing everything Sacred Heart Hospital had deemed she was worth, already becoming the disappeared again, already being erased for the second time in her life because Dr. Sterling had recognized what every predator recognizes: the most dangerous person in the room is always the one with nothing left to lose. The rain soaked through her jacket. The unit patch inside the lining remained dry, protected by layers of cotton and thread and 18 years of secrets. Katie closed her eyes and breathed. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The technique they taught at Coronado before you learn to breathe underwater, before you learn to breathe through pain, before you learn that some kinds of breathing are just mechanical repetition and others are an act of pure survival. 3 hours from now, Captain Morrison's eyes would open fully. 3 hours from now, the words he spoke would trigger a chain reaction that reached from this hospital in Savannah all the way to the Pentagon. 3 hours from now, people who had spent 18 years pretending Katie Morrison didn't exist would suddenly remember that she did, and that they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. But for now, in this moment, standing at the bus stop in the Savannah rain with a cardboard box and a unit patch no one was supposed to know about, Katie Morrison understood the truth that Dr. Sterling would spend the rest of his life regretting: she'd never been erased. She'd been sleeping. There was a difference. A crucial one. The bus pulled up. She boarded. The doors hissed closed behind her like the hiss of air escaping from a needle, and Katie Morrison disappeared into the wet night of a city that had no idea what was about to arrive. Make sure to like and subscribe to see what happens when the phone rings at the White House, when a classified file gets opened, and when the person Dr. Sterling thought he'd destroyed walks back into Sacred Heart Hospital wearing the authority of a senior chief who'd forgotten nothing and forgiven less. Comment below and tell us, would you have stayed silent like Katie, or would you have fought back immediately?